leading up to this historic election?
Well, Pastor, first of all, thank you for doing this, and I appreciate everybody for having me and for having an open mind to what I'm going to say, and hopefully I'll just answer your questions as well as I can. And I'd ask, we are in a house of God. Please spare a prayer for me and my family tonight. We certainly need it, and we need the wisdom and the courage of God. So I appreciate being here, and I appreciate everybody being interested in what I have to say. Thank you. You ask why this hasn't led the conversation. Why isn't this a national crisis and a national emergency? Because I knew that it was bad now. I actually didn't quite realize that it had been pretty bad for now going on 30 years. And I think probably the answer for why isn't this a more significant focus of American public life, why isn't this a more significant focus of this election, is that the American people who suffer the most under bad education and bad education policies are not the powerful, they're not the rich, and very often it is the rich and powerful that our conversation focuses on and not on common people, whatever the color of their skin. Because what was also so striking is that while, yes, those educational proficiency numbers were awfully bad and worse, they were worst of all for black people, I was kind of shocked that it's a majority of American children, if those statistics are right, and I believe that they are, a majority of American children of every race is not getting a quality education in the United States of America. That's a national scandal. But who is getting a quality education, right? I guarantee you the children of politicians are getting perfectly good education. And obviously I've got 3 beautiful kids myself. Our oldest is in 2nd grade, so we're not thinking that much about quality education. But if you look at where politicians send their kids, very often it is to private schools or at least to very fancy public schools where they know those kids are going to get a quality education. And a big part of why people are suffering today is because they don't have the same school choice that a lot of rich and powerful people have. And I think that's going to be part of the conversation, of course. But to me, one of the things we try to do in this campaign, and I know, I'm not going to get too political here. I want to respect the fact that we're in a house of God. But I do think that one of the things that we've tried to do in this campaign, and we haven't always done it perfectly, is to try to elevate the concerns of normal people. Right? Not just the rich, not just the powerful, not just the people who have political connections, but we tried to elevate the concerns of working people in the United States of America. And there's a whole host of issues, of course, that working people care a lot about, but I think that at the very top of that list is education, because if your kids don't have a good education, we know they're not going to be able to have much of a good chance at life.
Thank you. You mentioned something about faith, and
yeah.
I want to bring in some voices from the community. Jeff Coleman, who is the host of Morning Light on Lighthouse TV, he asked this question. This is what he says: political candidates aren't always clear about their faith.
Sure.
And because of that, people tend to make up what they want. How do you define your faith, and what do you believe?
Well, I appreciate that question. So I'm a devout, practicing, church-going Christian. And I say that. I was actually baptized for the first time in 2019, so that wasn't always true. And I was raised by my mamaw, and one of the things that I've always felt a certain affinity for the Southern black story in the United States of America, because the story of my family is that my family, obviously white, came from Appalachia and moved into the Midwest for good jobs in the steel mill. That's what brought my family out of the deep poverty of Appalachia. And I know that's a similar story for a lot of folks who grew up in the Delta, who grew up in the Deep South, who moved into Chicago, moved into Michigan, moved into Pennsylvania, because this was the land of opportunity. That's where, even if you didn't go to college, you had an opportunity to raise a family. Now, I was raised by that grandmother, because my mom struggled with opioid addiction for a big chunk of my life, and she was a woman of very profound Christian faith. She didn't graduate from high school, but she thought more about what the Bible required of her than any person that I've ever met in my life. And she was, in some ways a woman of many contrasts. She loved the Lord. She also loved the F word. I mean, she had a foul mouth on her, and I love Mamaw, but that's okay. But I remember when I went to, so I left high school. I served 4 years in the United States Marine Corps, and then by around the time that I got out of the Marines and was starting college at Ohio State, don't hold it against me, I know you're a Minnesota guy, I started to think that I knew more than Mamaw did. And I started to think that to be educated and to be knowledgeable in the ways of the world meant that I had to discard the Christian faith that Mamaw had raised me in. And I think that's a story for a lot of kids, a lot of adolescents. They start to think that they know a little bit, and then they start to think that they know a lot. And as I became a more mature young man, and I've got my beautiful wife Usha here with me today, and we. And I was dating her, I fell in love with her, I knew that I wanted to marry this beautiful young girl and I wanted to have a family with her, and you start thinking about the big questions about what do you want to be as a father, what do you want to be as a husband, what is required of me to be a good man, and I kept coming back to the answers were found in the gospel of Jesus Christ, and so that led me back to my faith, and I got baptized for the first time, like I said, in 2019, and we're actually flying to New York tomorrow morning, we're flying to New York tonight, but we got our 3 little kids who are going to be there, and we're looking for a church we can go to tomorrow morning in New York. It's a little bit troublesome to bring our kids to church because we've got about 40 Secret Service agents who come with us, so it takes a little bit of prior planning. But I think that, one of the critical, just if I could say one more thing on that, Pastor, one of the critical to me takeaways of the Christian faith is, whether big or small, whether rich or poor, Christian politics should be about the common good. Whether you're a Bible-believing Christian or not, you should pursue the kind of society where people can live a good life, where they can raise their children with good values, where if they work hard, they can earn enough to provide for a family. And I think fundamentally that is how I see my politics, as motivated by that sense that if you work hard and play by the rules, whether you agree with my religious faith or not, you ought to be able to provide for a family, you ought to be able to give your kids a good education, and you ought to be able to build a life in this country that all of us love. That, to me, is the politics of the common good, and it's very much influenced by my Christian faith.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to give you some voices from our community.
Yes, sir.
One of the things that I appreciate about this evening is my ability to champion something different than what typically happens. I truly and wholeheartedly believe that the church has to reclaim our ancient prophetic responsibility, which is the prophet's job was always to come to the lawmaker and make sure that you are securing justice for all people.
That's right.
And equity amongst equals has to be the tenor and the tone of the day. And so I want to give you a few voices from our community and then let you respond to which one you would like to. 5th grade student here in Harrisburg asked the question, why are teachers so underpaid? 11th grade student in Harrisburg makes a profound statement. I think this is ingenious. His mom is right here. The curriculum is outdated. I feel like it isn't changing fast enough. Learning is more about just knowing how to pass a test, and everything is constantly changing, but education is at a standstill. A parent in our community who graduated from the local high school says, I went to Harrisburg High School where we didn't have textbooks, and what we did have came from the 70s. I have seen the effects of 30-plus children in one classroom. 14-year-old kid from Harrisburg says these words, it's easier to get a gun on the street than it is to get a good job. And might I add, a good education.
Yep.
What is your response to the people in my community who have these concerns that stem from a very real lived experience?
Yes, sir. Well, that's some very difficult truth out there, and I'll try to respond to as much of it as I can because there's a lot there. And to whoever is the mother of that child, you ought to be proud of them because that's an interesting thought, and that's what we want out of our young people is to think interesting thoughts. So on the teachers who are underpaid, and I agree, a lot of our teachers are underpaid, and if you look at it, there's something really broken because to the young person who asked that question, we're spending more and more on education, and yet our teachers aren't getting the pay increases that they should. And of course, our kids aren't getting the quality of education increase that they should. And you ask why that is, and unfortunately, it's because we spend way too much on education bureaucracy, on education administration, and not enough on teachers and not enough on students. That's my sense of that problem. And by the way, this is one of the reasons why I really believe in the promise of school choice. Because when you give parents and you give the people who care the most about these children the control over those kids' education, they're going to choose better than anybody else what's best for their kid. But a lot of people can't choose because they don't have the money to choose. I mean, I grew up in a family where we did not have the money to choose. I went to Middletown High School because that was all that there was. And I was blessed to have some good teachers, but we got a lot of schools that are really underfunded and don't have the resources that they need, or for some complicated reason aren't giving kids a good education. One of the ways to solve this, I believe, is to give scholarships, is to give vouchers to every single parent, every grandparent who is caring for a child so that they can choose the educational choice that makes the most sense for their families. Now, I think, some of the other points that were raised about easier to get a gun than it is to find a job. There's a guy, I'm a Republican, and so typically Republicans are considered on the conservative side of the aisle. There's a very interesting book written by a very left-wing guy by the name of William Julius Wilson, a very profoundly intelligent black sociologist. I believe he's getting up there in years. I wouldn't be surprised if he's retired at this point. But he wrote this book called The Truly Disadvantaged, and it's about how when we lost all of our manufacturing jobs, America used to have the most powerful industrial economy in the world. We shipped a lot of those jobs to Mexico. We shipped a lot of those jobs to China. And we made it harder for people who didn't go to college to be able to earn a middle-class wage. I think that decision was a disgrace. I hate to say it, it was bipartisan. Republicans and Democrats participated in it. But one of the things we're trying to do in this campaign is say that if we can rebuild the manufacturing economy, we can rebuild the foundation of a middle-class life. So it's going to be easier to get a good job than it is to find a gun in the United States of America. That's got to change. I'm heartbroken by that because I don't want, if you grow up in a community where it's easier to find a gun than it is to find a job, then we shouldn't be surprised that a lot of young people, especially a lot of young men, are going to choose the gun instead of choosing the job if that's the easy option that's available to them. We have to make it easy to build prosperity and not easy to pursue a life of crime. And unfortunately for a lot of our kids, we're not doing that. I think that the one other thing that I'd say here is if you're a kid and you're looking to the future with hopelessness, your life is just going to be a lot harder. There are a lot of things that weren't easy about my life, but I always had a certain faith in the future. And if you don't have that faith in the future, if you don't have that hope in the future, I think it's the fundamental or a fundamental truth of the Christian faith is that God is in control, so we always got to have hope. But there are a lot of kids who don't feel that. And if we can create more hope out there, I think that's the best way to encourage these kids to get on the right pathway. But it's going to be hard unless people like me pursue smarter policies that give people access to quality education, that make sure the teacher pay does rise and not just a bureaucracy pay, and also to give parents and grandparents the choice of where to send their kids to school. We do all those things, and I think that's the best way to solve that problem of too many young kids not seeing the future as a place of hope.
I appreciate that. But here's my question, though.
Please.
We're America.
Yeah.
We're full of creatives. We're full of
Yes, we are.
Innovators. We can't have both and. We can't have a strong public school, which is the foundation of education in America, that our public schools can be properly funded and that the teachers can be taken care of, well paid, that the teachers union, which I wholeheartedly believe was instituted to take care of teachers.
Sure.
Right? And so I don't automatically believe that the motives are necessarily bad. They just may see it differently than I do. But is there a way for us in America to have both and? Strong public schools as well as school choice options for our parents?
So I think so, though I'll have to be honest with you that what I've seen over the last few years makes me worry that something about the teachers' unions, the leadership, not of course the membership, the great teachers who are doing a great job, but there's something about the leadership of the teachers' unions that has become so preoccupied with particular political viewpoints, or during the COVID pandemic is when I really lost my faith in a lot of the leadership of the unions, because they seem to be so preoccupied with keeping kids out of school, even well past the point when we knew that it was making our kids much less capable, when it was really hurting our kids' language and reading development. So I would like to believe that we can have both a strong public school system and a strong private school system. I do think that it requires, look, when you screw up, you ought to be honest with the people and say, look, I made a mistake. I do think it requires a little bit of the teachers having to come to the teachers' unions, the leadership of the teachers' unions having a bit of a come to Jesus moment, no pun intended, and saying to the American people, yeah, we kind of screwed up, but we're committed to the education of American children. We're going to fight for it. I do think that's important. The other point I'll say, Pastor, is, I'm not an expert in this. I won't pretend to be, but I try to read a lot and try to understand the implications of public policy. What I've seen is that when parents and grandparents get more school choice, it actually improves not just the private schools, it improves the public schools too. Because if the public schools know that there's competition, if they know that they don't have a monopoly control over the lives of these young people, they've got to step up and they've got to do a better job. And I think that's one of the strongest arguments for school choice, is not just to give parents and grandparents a choice, but to make the quality of our public schools better for the parents who choose that.
Interesting. Well, I wrote an article that made it to the Wall Street Journal this past year, and
that's a big one.
I'm hoping that we could be a discerning people, though, because the name of my article, what I entitled it, was different than what the public heard. The title that you all know the article under is Black Voters Demand School Choice. The title of the article for me was, Is This Really Democracy?
Interesting.
And here's why I wrote that article. School choice is a Republican-sponsored bill that's supported by 76% Democrats, 61% Republicans. Over 90% of black voters are in support of school choice. Over 80% of Hispanic voters are for school choice. And here's my question. Why aren't lawmakers listening to our voices and carrying out our wishes concerning school choice?
Well,
and is this democracy?
Well, I would say no, it's not democracy, as a matter of fact, because there are a lot of things, and again, I don't want to get too partisan in here, but there are a lot of things that I think are happening in this country right now that there's been no consent from the voting public to happen. Again, forgive me for making this argument, but did anybody, whether they voted for a Democrat or a Republican in the last election, did anybody consent to having their communities flooded with fentanyl over the last few years? I think the answer is no. So we got to get back to recognizing that government happens through consent, and if the American people aren't consenting to this stuff, then we got a real problem. And on the topic of school choice, so we have to ask ourselves, why is it that something that is universally popular is not actually happening right now? And I think, unfortunately, it's the reality of how interest group politics happens in Washington, D.C. And I've only been a senator for a couple of years, or how interest group politics happens in Pennsylvania or each of our individual states is, if you've got 10 people who don't have a strong political voice pushing for one thing, but then you've got one guy who's really powerful and connected pushing for something else, unfortunately, very often, it's the one guy who's in the ear of the politicians. That's who people listen to. They don't listen nearly enough to the 10 people who don't have as powerful of a voice. And what I think we need to do, I mean, if you're a school choice voter, and I believe in school choice, I really do. If you look at what President Trump, I sponsored legislation in the United States Senate to make it easier for parents to get access to vouchers so they could send their kids to school wherever they wanted to, because I think that's important. But whatever your views on this particular issue, if you're not willing to vote for the other candidate, if a particular politician thinks that he's going to be able to take your vote for granted, then he's never going to do what you want him to do. And I don't think that means you've always got to vote for my side, or that you're ever going to be wrong, or that you're always going to be wrong if you vote against my side. Look, I understand partisan politics is tough, and nobody is ever going to be perfect all the time. But I think it's important, and again, I know I'm speaking to a lot of black voters in the room, I think it's important for people to know that they can't take your vote for granted. And that is the way I think that we're going to get school choice, is that the people who support school choice start withholding their votes from politicians who refuse to do what the people want to do.
Here's my question. Here's my follow-up question to
Please.
that. There are some people who don't believe that school choice is a good or viable option for all Americans. There are some people who believe that school choice will be manipulated by the wealthy and that will be really a ploy to take away from our public schools. And I have to stand up because in case people don't know, I don't care what school you in. I care about the students.
That's right.
I don't care if it's public school. I care about the public schools because they have students. I don't care if it's private school, because if they have students, I'm concerned. I don't care if it's homeschool. But there are some people who fundamentally believe that if we have school choice in America, that money will take away from the public schools, which are already underfunded. In Pennsylvania, for instance, our public schools are underfunded because they're funded through property tax. And here in Harrisburg, I know you know nothing about like the Carlisle Pike, but the Carlisle Pike is a business district that brings in a lot of money.
Yep.
We don't have that in Harrisburg. So if the funding for our schools here in Harrisburg that house mainly black and brown people don't have those type of business districts, don't have those type of $1 million homes that drive up property tax that we could get viable, well-funded schools, then to introduce something like school choice sounds like you're trying to already take away from a system that is already hurting. And I don't want that to happen. What can we do to improve our public schools? I think I'm for school choice too. I'm for school choice, I'm for public schools. But here's my question. What can we do specifically for the public schools? Is there anything that we can do that can help the public schools, or can public schools thrive in a world, in America, with coinciding with school choice laws? Can we do both and?
So I do think that we can do both. I do think we can do both and that's part of the reason why I talked about, the evidence that I've seen. Again, I'm not an expert, but the evidence that I've seen suggests that school choice actually improves the quality of both the private schools and the public schools, right? So that is the both and solution in a lot of ways, is to create some competition. But I take your point. I take your point that, okay, what about the public schools that just don't have enough money to do what they need to do? Or what about, are we worried, to your point, that if we do school choice, it somehow just gets captured by an interest group, and the money's going to the interest group instead of to the students? Because I think both of us share this view that we care about the students. Look, I think that counsels in favor of us being careful, right? It doesn't mean that every private school is going to be perfect. It doesn't mean that we should do school choice and then just sort of wash our hands of the education system and say no more. Like, there are going to be, it's just the nature, it's human nature, right? I'm a Christian. I believe in that people sin, and no system, no matter how good it is, no matter how improved it is going to have faults in it. There are going to be problems with it. But do I think that promoting school choice is going to be an improvement on what we have today? I do think that. And to your particular point about public schools specifically, I think we have to ask ourselves which public schools are underfunded, because it's not all of them, right? It's not all of them. We know that some public schools have plenty of money, and some of those public schools need to spend more on teachers and students and less on bureaucrats. I have seen this statistic that if you look at the increase in school funding that we've had, very little of it's gone to the students and very little of it's gone to the teachers. It's all gone to administrators. So we got to change something about that equation, whether it's in private schools or in public schools. We want the money to go to the teachers and to the students. But I think, of course, look, if you've got a public school district where the per pupil spending, where the amount that we're spending per each student is way underfunded, then we've got to figure out how to solve that problem. And again, school choice to me, the way to think about it, at least the way I think about it, is not that school choice is going to fix every problem in American education, is that it's an incremental step towards giving parents more choice and giving children a better education. We got to do good. We got to make small improvements, and I think school choice is a way to make actually a big improvement, but it's not going to solve every problem, even though I do believe it's a big improvement.
Mother, father, move here from the Pali. They don't speak the language. Their child doesn't speak the language, can't read, but the public school is the catch-all, right?
That's right.
So I wholeheartedly believe sometimes our public schools need more resources and maybe more administrators to deal with these things. But you mentioned something that I think is very significant. When people come here that are this is a refuge for some people. And when I'm talking about
Sure.
people who come here legally, I'm not talking about illegal, but people
Sure.
who come here legally as a refuge, they usually don't go to the suburbs because that's too expensive. They come to the city. And when they come to the city, our schools can't do what Cumberland Valley or Mechanicsburg or Central Dauphin can do when they come to Harrisburg. And so I know competition sounds like the order of the day. Make the public schools compete. But I think there's a greater issue at hand. It's intentional that people of color are in neighborhoods like we are, something called redlining.
Sure.
Right? That make sure that people who live in this city, don't have the resources necessary. And I believe we live in a country now that we're free and we've made tremendous progress. I am so elated that we live in a country now that has the potential to have a black woman as a president, right? I praise God for that progress, right? But at the same time, we have to live in the tension. Do we need identity politics, or do we need politicians, lawmakers that will protect the interests of all people? And I'm concerned with the least of these.
Yes, sir.
And so when I speak of public schools, some of our public schools never have a chance. They can't compete because they're not on equal footing with their competitors. What do you say to a school like Harrisburg that doesn't have the business district and that is redlined in such a way that the resources will never come to them? How do they get proper funding for these kids in my neighborhood?
Look, it's a tough question, and obviously I don't know everything about the Harrisburg School District in the same way that I don't know everything about inner city Philadelphia, and I don't know everything about rural central Pennsylvania. But I think that there's got to be a combination kind of an all of the above approach, right? So we've already talked about school choice. I won't keep banging on about school choice. Look, I do think that we got to look at how much are we spending per kid, whether in the public schools and the private schools, and we want to make sure that each kid is having a fair amount spent on them. I mean, if a kid in Harrisburg is getting half the resources of a kid in some other community, well, that's a problem, and that's a problem that we got to fix, and I think we can fix it through a combination of state and federal policy, but that's something I'd love to work with you on and talk to you about, because I don't fully understand, in different states, different localities, right? There's property taxes interacting with state policy, interacting with federal policy. I think it's going to be hard to have a one-size-fits-all solution there, but I do think that people of good conscience can say it's ridiculous that because you grew up a black kid in a tough community, you don't get a chance at a quality education. That's why we have people like me going around. We're trying to fix problems, right? Or at least improve problems. So I'm committed to working on it. I'm not going to tell you that I know exactly what the solution is, because I think the solution is going to be 100 different problems. There's going to be 100 different solutions to each one of those problems. But I think the principle at work that we have to follow is, look, you cannot have a good life in the United States of America unless you start with a proper foundation of good education. I mean, we're in a house of God. Of course, education matters for skills and education matters for jobs, but how do you have a relationship with God, which I as a Christian would like people to do, if you can't even read the Bible, right? So there's a principle here that I think that we need to work towards. I think school choice is part of, but not the whole solution. But I think the rest of the solution is going to come from a combination of hopefully federal, state, and local policymakers trying to solve this problem. I do believe, I'm not an expert here. I do believe that one of the biggest problems that affects education, it affects the political divides that we have in our country, is that when we try to shut people off in tiny little enclaves and tiny little communities, and we don't let them leave, and we don't let them interact with their fellow Americans, of course that's what redlining did, I think that has a profoundly negative effect on our country. People ask why we have so much division in this country. I think the division is actually is downstream. It's a follow-on effect to the fact that we are living in more segregated neighborhoods than we were 40 years ago. It's a consequence of the fact that the gulf between rich and poor has actually gotten bigger than it did 30, 40 years ago. And I think that goes back to the decline, I hate to repeat this, the decline of the manufacturing economy. Because when you destroyed the foundation of millions of middle-class lifestyles, you destroyed the foundation fundamentally, I think, of any kind of commonality that we can build as a country. But I'm an optimist. And fundamentally, I think that we're at least talking about these problems. We haven't figured out all the solutions to these problems, but the fact that we're talking about rebuilding the middle-class manufacturing economy means that we're going to solve that problem, because that's what Americans do. I really do believe that. Black, white, brown, whatever the color of your skin, we solve problems, and we're at least talking about these things in a way that's going to lead to a solution. Let me tell you just one other context, or one other way I think about this is, so almost nobody in my family has a college degree. I was the first in my family, my immediate family, to get a bachelor's degree. So if you look at the life premium on having a bachelor's degree versus not going to college, I was shocked to learn this. A person with a bachelor's degree lives 7 years longer on average than people who don't have a bachelor's degree, okay? You want to talk about division? You talk about the fact that if you don't go to college, you die 7 years sooner than people who went to college. That's a real division. That's a real problem that people like me have to work and we have to fight to solve. I think a big part of it is rebuilding an economy that works for American workers again. I think a big part of it is letting people keep more of their hard-earned money. That's a big part of it. That's one of the reasons why I'm a Republican. I think part of it is fixing our education system, and like we talked about, school choice is part of it. But I am committed to solving the real problems. If I've got one frustration, and you'll never hear me complain about this campaign, because it's the honor of my life to be able to sit here in front of all of you and ask you to make me your next vice president. The one frustration I have is that politicians too often talk about the fake problems instead of the real problems. The real problem in this country is that way too many people have fallen behind economically. The real problem in this country is that if you don't have a bachelor's degree, a lot of people are going to lose years off their life because of it. Again, talk about my family a little bit. I believe I have one close relative I've ever seen make it to 70. Everybody else, from my dad to the grandfather who raised me, it's just like people die in their 60s, and those are the lucky ones. Well, that's a disgrace, and I think there are a lot of people out there who have seen far too few, especially of their male relatives, make it to the age of 70. You want to talk about inequality? How about the inequality of people not getting to spend a few extra years with their loved ones? We've got to do better, but we're only going to do better if we have politicians who are willing to talk about the real stuff and not the fake stuff.
Thank you. Maybe we'll end with this. I want to give you the vision for Black Pastors United for Education.
Yes, sir.
So we are embarking on this initiative called Every Church a School Initiative. We want every church in America to be involved in improving the educational plight of the American people. If you look at all of the statistics that injure our community, and I speak from a pastor's perspective, yes, and I've said this over and over, I'm a pastor, I'm not a politician. And this past summer, tragedy came to my home, right, to my family. 19-year-old cousin, shot, killed. She was 6 months pregnant, right? Horrible, right? And so right around where she was shot, there's churches everywhere. And the people, I love hearing the babies. Y'all hear the babies in here? I love them.
I like that
here.
too. That's good.
I'd rather them be in here than anywhere else.
That's right.
But if the young man or young woman, whoever shot her, was in an after-school program or a summer program or one of our schools, maybe pursuing destiny, pursuing this hope that you talked about, maybe we reduce the gun violence in our neighborhoods. I think the Church of Jesus Christ is the hope of the world.
Amen.
And because of it, I want to see every church in America be a part of this plight to improve the educational future of our children. And so I envision a world where every church would have the potential to do one of the four that I'm going to mention. Number one, a Christian private school. Imagine here in Harrisburg, we had a Christian private school with 700 boys from the inner city. And then turn around and do 700 girls from the inner city. Private Christian school out of the church. Yep. Or a learning center. We have a learning center here. We started this in the middle of COVID. When COVID happened, I was just being a pastor at the office. And my phone started ringing off the hook. 40 to 50 calls a day from parents after the public schools sent their kids home for COVID. And now the kids are virtual learners, and parents are calling saying, can my kids come there during the day? No. What do you mean during the day? But then I had a member of my church lose her job, a mother with a 7-year-old son. And we hired her. She was the after-school leader. We hired her to oversee the academic day of about 6 or 7 kids. And from that, now we have an academic learning center where 40 kids come here Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. And when they come to us failing. And in a brief time, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 months, the kids are doing well. Most of the kids who come to our learning center who are inner city kids, they don't have learning problems. They need a different environment. They come to our environment, and next thing you know, they're hitting the honor roll.
That's great. That's awesome.
Right? Learning centers, right? If that's not enough, and let me add a piece to that. Because of how we've done these learning centers, which is at a fraction of the cost for what we're paying for a lot of the education in America, I'm also able to hire members of my church, right, to do meaningful work in their community, building bridges. And then a summer program, right, after-school programs, summer programs. This past summer, we had 24 kids here. We split them up in 4 teams, and they built a restaurant, and they were a construction company. On Monday and Wednesdays, they were a restaurant. They made meats, sides, drinks, and desserts. We had a public day where people can come in and buy from them, and the kids made $200 a week, right? On Tuesdays and Thursdays, they were a construction company, painting a house right down the street for one of the members of the community, right? Every church in America should be able to do that. And we want to pay for it with our own taxpayer dollars. I don't want what I just said to be an opportunity just for the wealthy or just for the middle class, but I'm thinking about the single mother that has 4 kids. The oldest kid is in the public school doing absolutely fine. The second kid needs a private school because they have an affinity for aviation, and so we noticed that early in the child's life and want to send them to a private school that focuses on aviation. And then the 2 younger who struggle, who are differently able because they are on the spectrum of autism and need special type of services. I'm looking at that family and saying, man, what if they had a church that could help all of their students and affordability isn't an issue because we're leveraging our own taxpayer dollars. Can I say that again? Leveraging our own taxpayer dollars. Let me say it again. Leveraging, I thought I had a church. Our own taxpayer. Where's Brian at? We need Brian for the E flat again. And here's my question to you. Is it possible to leverage school choice laws to obtain this vision for America?
I think it is. And, you know, some things you didn't quite mention, but I think are related is I think that a lot of Christian ministries would love to help folks with childcare, but the federal monies that are out there that go to daycare very often can never be used by churches. Why is that? Why are we making it harder for Christian ministries to do Christian ministry? Why don't we make it easier for them? Because I think that churches are one of the most important, in my view, the most important part of the social fabric of this country. We got to stop trying to cut the church out of doing social services and Christian ministry. It's what they do best. You know, there's something, Pastor, called the Community Development Block Grant. A lot of money flows through the Community Development Block Grant, but not a lot of it flows to churches and to other organizations in the community that would like to be doing good because, unfortunately, our federal government, I think, has made it harder, again, for Christians to do the kind of Christian ministry that Christians do best. I think that there are a lot of ways to use the school choice vouchers, right? If you want to build a 700-boy school and a 700-girl school, then we ought to be facilitating that with the use of these voucher programs. And unfortunately, a lot of times we're not doing that. So we can do a lot better than that. And I think that public policy can play a really important role here. But I think that we got to get out of this mindset, and you hear this all the time, you know, separation of church and state means that we're not going to force you to believe in something you don't want to believe in. and we're not going to force any person to participate in a church service using the power of the federal government. That's an important American principle. It doesn't mean that we kick churches to the curb and prevent them from doing the Lord's work, which is what churches are supposed to do. We got to enable that stuff and not try to disempower churches. And I do think that's just a fundamental difference between how I see the world, and I know how President Trump sees the world, and a lot of other folks who are currently in positions of power. If I can make one more comment, and again, you'll forgive me for getting a little partisan, but I'm running for vice president. The election's in 9 days. I think that if you want to have successful public schools and successful private schools, one of the most important things is that kids can't learn if they've got an empty stomach. We got to make sure that our kids go to school fed, and if they're not, that they get an opportunity to do it in school. So there was a federal program that came out during the Biden-Harris administration, and it didn't get a lot of news, but the basic gist of it was that unless local school districts signed up for allowing biological males to participate in biological female sports, then those schools would be threatened with the reduction of their free and reduced lunch money, okay? Now look, I think it's crazy, to put my card, this is the partisan part, I think it's crazy to allow biological males to compete in sports with biological females. But even if you disagree with me, I think that it is such a terrible thing to take food out of the mouths of poor children because they don't do what the Biden-Harris administration wants them to do. We got to do better. We've got to be willing to say, you live your conscience, I live my conscience, but can we all agree that poor kids ought to go to school with full bellies? That is simple common sense that I'd like to get back to. So,
Well, here's one thing I will say though, Senator Vance, with all due respect.
please.
Harris and Biden are striving to make America the best country that they possibly can. And up until this point, we haven't said anything about the opposing. And I think we should keep it respectful because I believe that those people are doing the very best they can to serve the American people. And so this has been a respectful conversation, and I'm so glad that you would come and have this respectful conversation in this church. I think we are on the cusp of doing something tremendous in these United States of America if we stay together, if we work together.
I agree.
If we fight together. And watch this, if we make up after we fight, kiss
That's
each
right.
other, and stay brothers and sisters together.
Amen to that. So I did ask your forgiveness to get a little partisan, and again, it's 9 days before an election, so I got to do a little politic, and you'll forgive me that. But I agree. Look, I think all of us, whoever we vote for in this election, and I've got some strong disagreements, of course, with folks who vote for the other side, I do fundamentally believe that we're a country of good people that are trying to achieve a good future for the next generation of Americans together. I'm going to keep on working on it, and whatever responsibility the American people give me in 9 days, I'm going to keep on working on it, and I hope that you and I, not just in public but in private, can have some good conversations, because whether it's our public schools or how to make it easier for Christian ministry to do Christian ministry, I think you're an interesting voice, and I'd love to keep on hearing from it from time to time.
Thank you.
God bless you,
Thank
Pastor.
you for coming. Thank you for coming. Before you go, we prayed for the last candidate, and I'd like to pray for you.
Yes, sir.
Can we pray together? Gracious and eternal God, we give you thanks and praise for you have superintended this night in a way that only you can. And so, Lord, I thank you. I thank you for giving us the grace to speak about the things that matter so much to our hearts. Lord, I pray for Senator Vance that you would give him strength for the journey. I pray that you would give him wisdom to navigate the way. I pray, dear God, that his convictions would govern his behavior and his decisions, that the beauty, the uplift, and the furtherance of your kingdom would be paramount in the lives and minds of your people. And so, Lord, help us to create justice where there's injustice. Help us to be love where there's hate. Help us to be peacemakers where there's war. Help us to be hope where there's hopelessness. Lord, I pray in Jesus' name that we would be a resurrected body of people that would fight for your cause and do your perfect bidding in the earth. Would you help us to do these things? We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Yeah. One more moment. Oh. One moment, please. Please be seated. Just one moment. I can take a deep breath now.